Hey guys, what's up? It is the one and only RJ21 here, and today, to wrap up my coverage of Big Brother Canada 12, I will be doing one final player ranking where I will be assessing the games that each of the house guests played across the entire season. So with all of that preamble away, let's get right into the power rankings. At number 14, the house guest I believe played the worst game this season is Dinis. And as much as I love Dinis as a character and a general personality on the show, it's undeniable that Dinis played an absolutely abysmal game this season. In my opinion, winning competitions is one of the easiest ways to integrate yourself into the power structure. When the house is still formulating its power structure and nothing is really solidified or set in stone, winning competitions in the early stages of the game is one of the easiest ways to integrate yourself into the power structure, as it puts you in a direct position of power and influence. Yet Dinis is unable to do anything with his competition wins. I completely agree that Dinis did not and should not have won those first two vetoes. It did nothing to serve his game, but I would be able to excuse that if he was able to do anything with those vetoes. But he doesn't. He tends to be in the same position when he wins those vetoes and actually ends up in a worse position after winning them. He becomes this huge competition threat that gets taken out at the very first opportunity by his own ally, just proving that he made himself such a huge target that not even his closest ally was willing to keep him in the game, which is absolutely insane to me. But backtracking to the beginning of his game, he was in Anthony's entourage and was safe week one, yet was propped up as this big target that needed to get taken out. Anthony and Victoria were having conversations in week one about how Dinis needed to be taken out, even though he was safe, meaning that Dinis was automatically a target from the get-go. And that just shattered any sort of chances of building really solid and really stable social capital. And it just proves to be pretty ineffective. In the very next week, when he wins the veto, he has the opportunity to talk to Victoria and say, hey, what are the plans going on? Let me in on the loop. But instead of doing that, he says, do not tell me. You don't need to tell me, which is just very questionable. Like, you have this golden opportunity to be let in on some plans and maybe find yourself in some sort of alliance with Victoria, but instead you're choosing to step away and just let her do her own thing without involving yourself. Like, why? It seemed just like the perfect opportunity to build some sort of inroads, but he just chooses to reject it, and it's very questionable. And by the time of his boot, he should be safe. He should be safe. His number one ally is HOH, and he should be kept safe, but he's still taken out because he's just unable to solidify himself with Vivek. So it's really bad that that happens, and overall, he's just very ineffective in doing anything. He did have some good elements to his game where he was able to identify how big of a threat Anthony was going to be and how he did need to be taken out sooner rather than later, but he's just ineffective in being able to do absolutely anything. And because of that, I have to put him here at number 14. At number 13, I have Dinis' supposed number one ally and my preseason winner pick in Vivek. And to be quite honest, when I first drafted this list, I had Vivek at the very, very bottom because of how overwhelmingly negative his game is. There are so many opportunities where he just actively tanks his position and puts himself in a worse position moving forward in this game. However, after reassessing his game, I realized that there are some positive elements to this game, but it's still overall a generally bad game. Similar to Dinis, he doesn't survive a single round without some sort of immunity. He's safe with his entourage in week 1, the veto is used on him week 2, he wins HOH week 3, and then is taken out in week 4. Mind you, he is taken out because of a twist in the whole executive veto in a position where he was actually safe and wasn't going home, but still, he doesn't survive a single round without some sort of safety. Vivek seemed primed to make some sort of meaningful bonds, at least with like the guy side of the house. In the beginning, it seemed like he was getting along really well with like the likes of Tola, and I thought that was gonna build him some really decent social capital in that sense, but it seems like he really isn't able to do anything meaningful and substantial, and that just really harms his game early on, to where he is probably the biggest target coming out of week 1. In addition, he absolutely just blows up his game in week 2. It's very clear that he's playing from the bottom and he's just trying to do anything to claw and scratch his way out but he ends up just ruining his position even more, as it's very clear that he shouldn't be trusting the veterans, but he divulges all of his useful information to the veterans that makes himself an even bigger target. The blow-up he has with Bayleigh in the HOH room in week 2 just absolutely tanks his game and really deters anybody from wanting to meaningfully work with him. Vivek is saved week 2, but through no active gameplay of his own. It's really just Victoria succumbing to her own delusions and really erratic emotional gameplay. And Vivek comes out of that thinking, oh yeah, I'm so good now, when in actuality, that's not really what happens. Like, he genuinely doesn't contribute anything to himself being saved, which is absolutely horrible. And then we get to his peak worst move in the season of him taking out his number 1 ally in Dinis, which makes no sense. It's so early on in the game that you have to be able to hold on to your numbers. And Dinis was like the only number that he had for a very long time. And the fact that he took him out in that position was absolutely horrible. I genuinely don't think that if Vivek takes Dinis out, Vivek is like still not going to be in a great position, but he's still not going to be like as big of a target as Anthony propped Vivek up to be. However, Vivek clearly just falls for Anthony's miss and just falls into that trap and takes out his number 1 ally in a position where he absolutely should not have. However, in the short term, Vivek's decision to take out Dinis does actually work out for him pretty well, as he actually does really start to side with Anthony's side of the house, and he does build some social capital with that side. It's not a lot, but at least it's something. And to be fair, he did get twist screwed out of the game with the executive veto. But the fact that he was so expendable for that side of the house, and the reason he gets put up is directly because of the move he made against Dinis, is definitely a knock against his game. And while there are some good points to it, like how he is able to identify how big of a threat Anthony is, and his ability to reconvene after losing his number 1 ally, I do respect that, but overall it's still a very bad game, which is why I have him here at number 13. At number 12, I have the first boot in Janine. And it's so weird having Janine this high on the list, considering she literally is the first boot of the season. But Janine, I don't think actually does anything too actively wrong to get her sent out in the first week. We see that she is included in the initial majority alliance in the Big Sisters alliance. Mind you, it's about as real as like any of like the all-women alliances that are formed on any given season of Big Brother. But it was the initial majority alliance, and she does have some solid inroads in there. She has a really solid tie with like Donna and stuff like that. So Janine does at least have something going for her. But after that, Janine's game just really goes downhill. It seems like Janine was mostly targeted for who she is as a person, as Anthony perceived Janine as somebody who was unmanipulatable and somebody that he wasn't able to control. And that's simply just due to Janine being one of the older women in the house, and Janine simply just not being the type of person to fall for Anthony's sort of manipulation tactics. Despite Janine wanting to take Anthony super far in the game, Janine is just like the type of woman who's not going to be able to fall for those sort of manipulation tactics. And because of that, she's the primary target. And after she becomes the primary target, it just becomes so apparently clear that she's just not going to survive the week. I mean, after she loses the veto and it's set in stone that she's sitting on the block, she kind of just gives up. And she becomes resolute in the fact that she is going home. She does make at least a solid effort to try and campaign, but it's ultimately ineffective as she goes home in a unanimous vote. So after she gets proclaimed to be the target and after she loses that veto, she just simply has no chance. And it's pretty kind of depressing that she just like essentially gave up and she wasn't able to express all of her options to try and stay in the game. But ultimately, Janine just doesn't do anything in her time. She was a little bit passive, and the fact that she isn't able to get even just a single sympathy vote to keep her in the game is a little bit disappointing. But Janine was just ultimately ineffective in doing anything in this season, but she wasn't as actively bad as the previous two people I've talked about, which is why she is here at number 12. At number 11, I have Donna. And Donna is truly one of these house guests where it's so tough to assess her game because of how early she goes on in the season. I know I talked about how Janine really wasn't targeted for any solid reason, But that's more so the case for Donna. Like, there was no reason why Victoria should have targeted Donna in her first HOH. Like, it genuinely doesn't make any sense. Like, Donna was a loyal ally to Victoria. And it is a knock against her game, the fact that Donna isn't able to convince Victoria of that fact. But still, Donna was a loyal ally to Victoria and could have taken Victoria much further on in the game. But Victoria just chooses to take Donna out in a position where it just doesn't make any sense. But to more so focus on Donna's game, she, just like everybody else we've talked about so far, doesn't survive this game without any sort of safety. She's safe with Anthony's entourage in week 1, nominated week 2, and then taken out. So that is definitely bad, but she definitely did some effective work. She builds really solid bonds with the likes of forming a final 2 with Bayleigh and having a supposed showmance with Todd, of all people, which I feel like they would have focused on more, but the fact they didn't just shows how insignificant it was. But I digress. Donna almost comes close to staying. She gets the votes of Bayleigh, Todd, and Dinis, and would have gotten the vote of Vivek had the votes actually been in her favor to stay. So there definitely was a serious effort to try and keep her in the house, meaning a lot of people in the house did view Donna as a valuable ally and a valuable asset they could have kept for longer in this game. All things considered, she seems to be a very competent player. She seems to have a pretty level head on her mind, and she shows that she is pretty good at forming solid social bonds with people in the likes of like Bayleigh, as she had an undeniable final 2 with Bayleigh, and they would have gone to the end together. And I genuinely think that Donna, if she were to ever return, does have the potential to do very, very well. I think that Donna has a pretty solid strategic mind, as she is able to recognize that, oh, hey, maybe there are some moves that need to be made. I do question her choice to try and target Anthony. If she sees Anthony and Victoria in the HOH room all the time together, why would you go to Victoria and say target Anthony? Like, that just doesn't make any sense. So that's definitely questionable in that sense. But overall, Donna just plays a very weird game. Not weird in the sense of like, oh, Donna makes a lot of weird moves, but it's weird in the sense that she doesn't do anything like egregiously bad to get her targeted. Like, it's really just Victoria falling victim to her own delusions. And because of that, Donna's game is overall very difficult to assess. It's one of these games that just got cut way too short, and it's like we never really got to see her game fully flesh out. So while it is unfortunate with what she did have, it was pretty decent, but the fact that she was taken out so early, I have to put her here at number 11. At number 10, we will not be wrapping up the pre-jurors, but instead be talking about the first juror. We have Elijah. And Elijah is just such an infuriating player because it's very clear he knows the game a lot better than how he actually played. In the jury roundtable, he talks about the difference between being a floater and a coaster. Like, that is some serious super fan territory that I'm pretty sure not even most super fans actually know of. So the fact that he has such an in-depth knowledge of the game proves that he has the workings to be a great player. It's just the fact that he's not able to execute anything that makes him appear as such. He literally does not spend a single week off of the block without some sort of safety. He has entourage safety week 1. He has his HOH win in week 4, but every other week he's on the block. He only cast 1 vote this entire season. Like, that is such a crazy prospect to me. The fact that he was literally never able to come off the block unless he won something. And I think the game-ending move for Elijah was volunteering to be a pawn during Victoria's HOH. I said it back when I did my week 2 power ranking, and I'm going to reiterate it now. Elijah choosing to be a pawn for Victoria was absolutely horrible. In his eyes, he wanted to gain trust with the Directors Alliance, but in actuality, it just opened himself up to be the pawn star of the season. It just opened himself up to be this easy person that can and is willing to go up on the block. Despite Elijah expressing that he doesn't want to go up on the block, but he ultimately becomes resolute in becoming that role within the house, and he ultimately becomes the most expendable player in the house. Like, if a close ally, somebody who's much higher in the power structure, or somebody who's much better integrated within the entire house is sitting on the block next to Elijah, then they're gonna get rid of Elijah. Like, Elijah is just somebody who's not worthwhile trying to actively keep in this game. He's just another body that people are just going to use, and it's really disappointing to see that because Elijah has the makings to be a pretty decent player. And we do see that Elijah does have some effective gameplay in towards the end of his stay in the house. He does build this final two with Todd. Mind you, it's more so Todd picking up Elijah as a number more so than Elijah pursuing Todd as a final two. But still, he is able to make some solid ties in that sense. So it is pretty good in that sense. But the fact that he's unable to build any meaningful long-term game relationships is just really concerning. And despite him making it to become the first juror of the entire season, I just can't forgive how actively bad his gameplay was, in the fact that he was just unable to do anything effective to better his position. And he was just simply just expendable to everybody. And he was taken out in a position where he is sitting next to quite literally one of the biggest threats in the house at that time in Avery, yet goes home unanimously. So because of that, I have to put Elijah here at number 10. At number 9, we're now wrapping up the pre-jurors, as here we're going to be talking about Matthew. And Matthew was a pretty insignificant figure, like in terms of him as a player, all things considered, across his entire run on this season. I mean, he is probably the most forgettable house guest in this entire cast, like because of how passive of a player he was. He was super passive in the sense that he really just finds his people and just sticks with them. He doesn't really make any active efforts to try and bond with the other side of the house, unless it's like the director's alliance. But even then, he's more so just dragged into that alliance, more so than him strategizing to try and get himself ingrained within that power structure. He's more so just like dragged into it. And that's definitely concerning in terms of like his passivity as a player. But he actually does some pretty effective work in building such a strong tie with Anthony's side of the house. I mean, in that pre-jury phase of the game, he is Anthony's number one ally. He has his showmans with Lexus, and he has a very strong side with Tola. So it's very clear that he is very well ingrained within at least Anthony's side of the house, which does give him some points. It's just the fact that he's unable to diminish his threat level because of how big of an apparent physical threat he's most likely going to be. There definitely was some like overlooming precedent from the previous season, considering how last season's winner in Ty literally dominated the entire season because of his ability to just win vetoes and win competitions. So Matthew definitely came into the season with a bit of a target on his back, as people definitely anticipated there being those physical competitions that somebody like a Matthew could dominate. So Matthew just inherently had a huge target in that sense that he was just unable to shake. Mind you, he literally doesn't win like any sort of like meaningful competitions. He does win like have not in luxury competitions, but like he doesn't win an HOH and he doesn't win a veto. He doesn't even really come close to winning any of those competitions. So that's definitely concerning in that sense, that he was actively diminishing his threat level and that he wasn't a physical competition threat, yet they still perceived him as such, and that definitely hurts his game. I do have to give him some credit in the fact that he does seem like a pretty strategically sound player. When he does get wind of the fact that he is most likely going to be going on the block, he is able to do some effective work in campaigning to the likes of Avery and saying that this is not a good move. And it rightfully wasn't, as Matthew seemed to be a pretty solid ally for Avery that was on the other side of the house. And Matthew does come very close to saying he has a 4-3 vote. And mind you, that fourth vote was probably never going to happen. But still, the fact that he was still able to get his entire side to stick loyal with him to the end, in a position where other people would most likely fold and be like, you know what? I'm not going to give you that sympathy vote. I'll just vote you out anyway, since that's what the house wants. But the fact that he's able to keep his allies so solid with him to the point where they will vote to keep him, even if they know he's going home, does definitely show that he is a pretty solid social player. He is pretty good at building those bonds and evolving them into those game relationships. But ultimately, he's just such a passive player with such a big target on his back that he's unable to shake, that his run ultimately ends up being in the pre-jury. And because of that, I have to put him here at number 9. At number 8, we are jumping a bit forward in terms of placements, but here I have Tola. And Tola is literally just the better competitor version of Matthew. I'm not even trying to exaggerate. That's literally like the same trajectory Tola has is literally what Matthew would have had if Matthew didn't go home. As soon as Matthew goes home, Tola assumes the same position as Matthew in becoming Anthony's right-hand man. Tola is the primary target for the women's side of the house. I mean, in week 1 even, when Tola was not safe, the women were actively campaigning to try and get Tola up on the block. Tola was a target from day 1, and it seemed like he just didn't get along with a lot of the women on his cast. Maybe not in the sense of like, oh, Tola's a bad person, but more so that Tola was never able to find that common ground where they found him to be a playable ally that they wanted to keep in the house. Tola was just always that primary target for them, and Tola was never really able to regain his social capital in that sense, at least with that side of the house. He was a primary target, and they wanted to even target Tola week 2. We see the likes of Bayleigh and Donna actively campaigning to Victoria to try and get Tola up on the block and taken out over Vivek, despite Vivek being the house target. So Tola is doing a pretty poor job in that sense in preserving his own game. However, he does have some pretty good survivability. I mean, he does survive 2 pretty big evictions in a unanimous vote. He would have survived against Todd. He does survive against Vivek, and he survives against Kayla. Like, Avery has Tola up on the block, and Tola is literally the person who takes Avery out of the game the very next week. But the fact that Tola is able to survive against Kayla is pretty impressive. Mind you, it's not through any actual, like, active strategic work of his own, but more so the work of his allies. But still, he does have that survivability aspect to his game that does need to be accounted for. In terms of his strategic gameplay, it's pretty passive, it's pretty baseline. I have my side, and I'm going to target people on the other side. That's quite literally the extent of Tola's strategic thinking, especially when considering like his HOH reign. He has Avery as his target, he puts up Avery and Bayleigh, and wants to take out a number on that side of the house. Pretty baseline stuff. Mind you, it's probably the right move for his game. I mean, out of all of the HOHs this season, Tola probably has one of probably only like 2 good HOHs throughout the entire season. So it does make sense for Tola to make the pretty baseline move, but still, he has pretty baseline thinking. Nothing like super out of the box or nothing super complex. It's pretty standard. Overall, Tola's game is pretty standard. Is nothing really like exemplary about it. There's nothing that really stands out. It's literally just like a better version of Matthew. And because of that, I have Tola here at number 8. At number 7, another person who makes it pretty deep in the game, but here I have Todd. And Todd is a pretty weird player, all things considered. He's a bit of a unicorn in the sense that the first 3 weeks of the game, he does quite literally nothing. He has a non-existent showmance with Donna, and outside of that, does quite literally nothing. Like, we see him talk to Anthony in week 1, but that really doesn't evaluate into any meaningful game relationship until like the very, very end of the game. So in those first 3 weeks, he does nothing of substance. However, after the executive veto, we really start seeing him starting to pick up his gameplay. He picks up an alliance with Elijah and becoming Elijah's number 1 ally. He picks up a really solid ally in Tola to where they convene with each other to make a big move during the movie night massacre and trying to take a shot at Kayla. Like, that's super impressive, all things considered. Like, even though the move doesn't go through and they don't actually execute on that plan, Todd is able to escape that whole situation nearly scot-free. Even though he is put up on the block the very next week, he isn't like the primary target, and he most likely doesn't go home considering his inroads that he has with Bayleigh. And that's where the bulk of Todd's game comes from, is his relationship with Bayleigh. Once he builds that bond with Bayleigh back in week 2, Todd is pretty solid coasting throughout a majority of the season, as Bayleigh is somebody who wants to actively protect Todd as much as she can in this game, to the point where Todd going home is probably in the best interest of players like Victoria, but they end up keeping Todd around because Todd is perceived as such a valuable ally in that sense. If anything, the one thing I don't like about Todd's game is how expendable he made himself. Like, it's pretty clear that he recognized that he was on the bottom of Victoria's power structure, but the fact that Todd really wasn't willing to try and convene with Anthony's side of the house and really like solidly play the middle, but was more so resolute in being on the very bottom of Victoria's power structure definitely does concern me. Like, him being in that swing vote position was probably one of the best positions he could have been in, but he chooses Victoria's side and chooses to be an expendable number in that sense. And I don't necessarily like that, as that definitely does contribute to his overall passivity as a player. And I don't necessarily value that as highly, but he does a lot of actively good things. He's overall just a very playable ally and a very valuable number that is necessary for a lot of the moves that are made in the latter stages of the game. And by the end game, like, he does have some serious win equity. Like, if he's sitting next to the likes of like a Lexus or an Anthony, he wins that jury vote. Like, I was not expecting Todd to be a competition threat in that sense, but he was able to build some respect with the jury through his competition wins. So that definitely is a merit for his game. However, his overall passivity in his gameplay and how he was just remaining stagnant in his final two with Bayleigh, and would most likely lose against Bayleigh in the final two if he does sit next to her, and the fact that he was just resolute and fine with that and not actively making moves to branch himself out outside of Bayleigh in the latter stages of the game definitely does concern me. But he does have a lot of positives going for his game in terms of his longevity, which is why I have him here at number 7. At number 6, I have Avery, and we're going to be seeing a lot of the hot chocolate women in succession in these upcoming spots, but Avery is here at number 6 because I think she played the worst out of everyone in the hot chocolate alliance. I do have to give her some credit in the fact that she was Victoria's right wing woman, and because she was Victoria's right hand woman, Avery was consistently in a position of power. Whenever Victoria's in power, Avery was also in power because of how adjacent she was to Victoria. And that did give her a lot of social capital in this game. She was able to build a lot of solid bonds with a lot of players that are even outside of her alliance, with the likes of like Matthew and Elijah, two numbers that were really valuable to her. She was able to pick up. Mind you, she takes them out in an unnecessary fashion, and that ultimately does end up tanking her game and her positioning, but still, she is able to build those inroads, and that does put her in a position of power. Despite being in a very solid position of power throughout the entirety of the pre-jury phase, once we get to like her first HOH, we really start seeing Avery's game crumble. Her taking out Matthew was not a good move for her game, as she becomes the secondary target for Anthony's side of the house, where coming into the movie night massacre, she is the secondary target. She's put up on the block as a pawn next to Kayla, and because Kayla won that veto, had the nominations gone wrong, Avery is most likely that primary target that does end up going home. And she really does get lucked out in the fact that Elijah is the one who's put up on the block, and the fact that she does still have all of those solid inroads with people who do want to keep her in the game, mostly with the likes of like Victoria and Kayla. So the fact that she is able to survive the movie night massacre in a position where it was optimal for Anthony's side to take her out does give her some credence. But then we get to her second HOH, and this is her game-ending move. Her taking out Kayla makes literally 0 sense. Let me reiterate, it made no sense for Avery to take out Kayla in her position. Like, from Victoria's position, it makes sense why she would want to get rid of Kayla, considering that Kayla was saying Victoria's name, or supposedly was saying Victoria's name. So it makes sense why Victoria wants to get rid of Kayla. But why would Avery want to get rid of Kayla? Like, it really doesn't make any sense. Like, it's very apparent that Kayla has pledged her loyalty to Avery. And so Avery, out of all people, should be the one campaigning the hardest to keep Kayla in the house, denying all of these claims, saying that no, Kayla is not this conniving person that we think she is. She's somebody who is with us. But because she is so far ingrained with Victoria that she is the wannabe. She's literally wannabe. She literally just wants to do whatever is best for Victoria's game. She wasn't playing for herself to win. She was playing for Victoria to win. And we even see that in her exit interview, where she was resolute and fine if she was going to come in second place to Victoria, because she loves Victoria that much. And it's so painful to watch as a player, because you want to see these players playing for themselves to win, not playing for other people to win. So despite how big of a superfan Avery claims to be, her gameplay does not back that up, as she doesn't play for herself to win. Like, it's so painful, because we see that Avery does have the makings of being a pretty stable strategic thinker that is able to make pretty solid inroads to better her position. But the fact that she's just unwilling to use those connections for herself, but instead using them for Victoria, is just so painful. And we see her come up in the very next round where she loses the veto and she just doesn't have the votes to stay. She does get her sympathy vote from Victoria, but still she goes home, and it's solely because she took Kayla out. Like, if she doesn't take Kayla out, she's most likely going to make it much further in the game. But despite all of those negatives I have about her game, her initial first half of the game was still very strong in that she was able to build those very solid connections. But it's as soon as she gets into positions of power where she really starts decimating her own game. So because of that, I have to put Avery here at number 6. At number 5, I have Kayla. And out of all of the hotter chocolate women, and when I say hotter chocolate, I mean the contingent that forms between Victoria, Avery, and Kayla. But out of those three, Kayla is probably the most level-headed thinker out of them all, and that really does show in her strategic prowess. I do think she is a very solid strategic thinker, and she is able to identify what her correct moves are, and because of that, she does put herself in a very solid position. Her only issue is that she's not able to effectively implement a lot of the plans that she wants to enact. She really does play second fiddle to Victoria and Avery. Despite Kayla wanting to go to the end with those three, she was always going to be third place. She was always going to be that threat that needed to win competitions in order to make it to the end. And while Kayla was capable of doing that, it sucks that Kayla had to be in that position in the first place. I think the major turning point in terms of a downward trajectory for Kayla's game comes in Avery's first HOH, where Kayla really makes herself the primary target for Anthony's side of the house. She makes it very, very apparent that she is the primary voice that wants to send Matthew home, and people are picking up on that. Kayla makes it adamantly clear to her side of the house that I want Matthew gone. I want him gone. I want him gone. I've never been trying to campaign for him to stay. But because she's so adamant in making that publicly clear, she becomes the primary target. And she gets targeted in the Movie Night Massacre, where if she doesn't win that veto, she's going home. Wholeheartedly, Kayla's the first member of the jury. And while she becomes the second member of the jury, still, she does put herself in that position where she needs to win those competitions. In my opinion, Avery and Kayla are interchangeable, but the reason I have Kayla higher than Avery is because I think Kayla does less actively wrong to get her sent home in comparison to Avery. With Avery, there's a clear chain of moves that she makes that ultimately ends her demise. But with Kayla, it kind of just comes out of nowhere. Kayla getting targeted by Avery was just so far out of left field, nobody could have imagined it coming. Anytime soon. The fact that Kayla isn't able to convince Avery and Victoria that she is a valuable number to their side to keep herself off the block is definitely a concern, and it is definitely very unfortunate. But as soon as Kayla went up on the block, there was no way she was going to stay. She already had those 3 locked votes against her in Anthony, Lexus, and Todd, so there was zero chance that she was going to stay. Adding on to that, the fact that both Bayleigh and Victoria had already turned on her at that point, there was no way Kayla was going to stay. But Kayla doesn't really do anything actively wrong for Avery and Victoria to target her, but it's more so the fact that Kayla is unable to reassure the both of them of her allegiance to them. Mind you, it's on the basis of a bunch of lies, and Kayla was telling the truth and saying that those are lies and I did not say those things. But the fact that she is unable to convince them is definitely a demerit against her game. But because of the less actively wrong she does that ultimately leads to her demise, I have Kayla here at number 5. At number 4, I have Lexus. And Lexus is probably the most passive player out of everyone in the Hot Chocolate Alliance, but I'm very impressed by her gameplay. She plays a truly low-key, under-the-radar game. And while it doesn't garner that much respect from the jury, it's still very effective in getting her very deep into the game. I find it super impressive how Lexus was essentially disowned by her alliance, but she's able to reconvene and recover from that fact. Lexus makes it very clear that she wants to work with Hot Chocolate. She wants to work with these women, and she wants to ensure that a black woman does in fact win this game. But she essentially just gets disowned by them. For seemingly no reason. We see that Victoria, Avery, and Kayla just don't consider Lexus to be one of the girls'. And it's just really unfortunate. it's so adamantly clear that they just don't like her. Like, they make a lot of comments about her that I find just to be super icky about, like, her personal, like, the way she conducts herself and her overall demeanor. Like, they make disparaging comments against her, and it's just so unjustified. Like, Lexus wanted to work with them so badly, but they just didn't like her, and it just sucks. Like, it really sucks for Lexus. Like, she wanted to go after this initiative, but the people she wanted to do it with just simply didn't like her. However, all of that aside, the fact that she gets disowned by those people, but then is able to reconvene and solidify a power structure with the opposite side of the house is very impressive. She gets disowned by Victoria, Avery, and Kayla, but finds new allies in Anthony and Matthew and Tola, which is all very impressive work. Like, if any other player would have gotten disowned by their alliance, they would have just become a floater. They would have just become another body in the house. But the fact that Lexus is able to recover and find new allies that not only trust her, but want to take her far in the game, that's so impressive. And I'm thoroughly glad that she was able to reconvene and put herself in a much stronger position than beforehand. One of the biggest issues I have about her game, though, however, is how willing she is to just be a pawn. Like, in those later stages of the game, she just goes up on the block just so many times. Like, during Victoria's HOH, during Anthony's HOH, during Bayleigh's HOH. Like, Lexus just goes up on the block and allows herself to be put in those positions of risk where she most likely could go home if competition results really went the wrong way. Like, all things considered, like, it's just really, really bad in that sense that she just allows those things to happen. But at the end, it does actually in turn end up contributing to her longevity, because she is seen as just such a trustworthy ally that she's somebody that anybody could depend upon, and somebody that if you are aligned with Lexus, she is going to support you and she's going to have your back. And the fact that she's able to present herself as this reliable and playable ally that you can depend on is so good for her game, and it just demonstrates that. And she demonstrates that in spades throughout her entire stay in the house. So it's overall just like very, very impressive what she's able to do. I do think I have issues with her passivity in terms of like her strategic play. Like, she really just does align herself with Anthony in that endgame stage and doesn't really like build any meaningful bonds that could evolve into anything in those endgame stages. She would have been brought to the final two by Bayleigh, but that's more so because Bayleigh didn't want Anthony in the end, more so than Bayleigh wanted to take Lexus to the end. And the fact that Lexus isn't able to confirm to Anthony that she is loyal and that should be taken to the end, like the fact that Lexus isn't able to do that is definitely concerning. But I feel like Lexus's longevity and the fact that she is able to become such a dependable person in the house that people want to keep long term, and the fact that she's able to out-survive the hotter chocolate women that have been wanting to target her and take her out of the house, the fact that she's able to outlast all of them despite them actively targeting her is so impressive. And because of that, I have Lexus here at number 4. At number 3, I have Victoria. And this season was quite literally primed for Victoria to win. Like, Victoria enters this game as an all-star with a bit of a target on her back because she is an all-star, but she comes into the season as a very respected and a very well-liked all-star, where she's not a threat in the sense of like, oh, her last season she was this big strategic player that we need to get out. No, she comes into the season a threat because she's an all-star, but because of her reputation on her previous season, she's seen as this iconic queen that all of the women want to work with, and she does find herself in that initial position. She's in the initial majority alliance with the Big Sisters alliance, but we see constantly throughout this game that she's such an irrational and erratic emotional player that just makes a lot of her strategic decisions on a whim. She makes so many illogical decisions throughout her entire gameplay throughout this entire season that it's only reasonable that Victoria is like the only player who could be literally gifted a season on a silver platter and still not make it to the final two. Like, this season was primed for her to win, but she just fumbles it so hard. She fumbles it so hard by making so many questionable moves. We go to her first HOH where she targets Donna. Like, if you're really worried about this East Coast alliance like existing, don't take out Donna, take out Todd, the person you not only don't have a relationship with, but you don't have an alliance with. So you have Donna, who is this loyal figure within your big sister's alliance, but instead of choosing to go after the easy pawn who's on the outside of the house in Todd, you choose to blow up your power structure with the big sister alliance and possibly sow in a lot of mistrust within that alliance with people like Bayleigh, and you're choosing to take out Donna. Like, it doesn't make any sense. We then get to the executive veto, where she chooses to use the executive veto on a Todd in a position where it doesn't really benefit her game to use the executive veto on Todd, but it more so benefits Bayleigh's game, and she allows herself to get influenced by Bayleigh. And it really does start forming the cracks between herself and Anthony that ultimately becomes her comeuppance in this game. Like, she's showing that she's not going to just do whatever Anthony says. Mind you, I don't think anybody should just blindly do whatever Anthony says. Like, the fact that Victoria does have that autonomy in her game definitely does speak to like her like respectability as a player, that she is willing to act upon her own actions and is always going to do what she perceives as the best interest for her game and not playing for somebody else. So that is something to give merit in that sense. But if Victoria truly understands Anthony as a player, she has to understand that Anthony is not going to like actions that are made against his best favor. And we directly see that in the very next week, where Avery is HOH and Matthew is the target. Victoria puts up another act and acting like there is a chance that Matthew is going to stay when that actually isn't the case. Victoria is actively involved in taking Matthew out, and that just further sows a lot more mistrust between herself and Anthony. We then get to the movie night massacre, where Victoria tries double backing on what she did in the previous 2 rounds and tries reaffirming her allegiances to Anthony by taking out Elijah. And it does build some repertoire in the short term, but in the long term, it just looks really shady and is used as further information to prove how unloyal and how untrustworthy of a person or as a player that Victoria is. We then get to the Kayla boot, where Victoria takes out Kayla, where she once again is targeting a woman in her core power structure that is blindly loyal to her. Like, I don't know what it is about Victoria, but she just doesn't seem to see the value in keeping her allies around. Like, she hears one inkling that Kayla was not loyal, and she doesn't even try and fact check anything. She just hears this and immediately says, we need to take out Kayla. And then Kayla does get taken out. Victoria then the very next round casts a sympathy vote against Bayleigh in favor of Avery, and that just creates even more mistrust for Victoria, where Bayleigh starts mistrusting a lot of the things that Victoria is saying, that ultimately leads to her getting taken out. Mind you, Victoria's HOH, where she does take out Tola, is pretty good, as I think that is probably the other only good HOH throughout this entire season. But then we see her get taken out during the final 5 in a position where it's probably not even Anthony's best move to take Victoria out in that position. But still, because of all of the flip-flopping that Victoria's done in the past, it becomes her comeuppance in this moment. If you're going to betray Anthony, or if you're going to betray the women, you got to pick a side. Like, honestly, because of how involved of a player she is, she has to either play a lot more cleanly, which I think she's just simply incapable of doing, or she just has to pick a side. She tried playing both sides for far too long. Even in her boot round, she tries acting like she was always loyal to Anthony and she was never making moves against Anthony, when that's just clearly not true. There are so many actions Victoria makes in this game that are actively against Anthony that it's honestly a bit surprising that Victoria has fallen victim to her own delusions into thinking like she's convinced herself fully that she was never against Anthony and she was never going to make a move against Anthony, when we know that that's simply just not the case. Like, it's honestly so intriguing to watch Victoria as a player, as she's somebody that is so driven by her emotions and tries playing it off as like strategic gameplay. It's so intriguing to watch. Like, Victoria will always be an entertaining figure within the Big Brother Canada sphere because of like her character and all of the chaos that she always sows. And while she does make a lot of questionable moves throughout the entire season, we cannot deny the absolute dominance she had over the social strategy part of this game. Like, She has so many social bonds that carry her so far in this game. It's honestly very, very impressive. And it's it's so shocking that Victoria was able to blow up all of this great social capital that she had. But what else can you expect from Victoria? So because of the very mixed bag she has, but the overall dominance she had over this game and the huge amount of win equity she has by the end of the season, I have Victoria here at number 3. At number 2, I have the winner of Big Brother Canada 12 in Bayleigh. And when I first drafted this list, I had Bayleigh at number 1. As I was so impressed by her latter 2/3 of the game, I thought that it was deserving of the number 1 position. However, when doing these player rankings, you have to assess a player's game as a whole. And while the latter 2/3 of her game is very impressive, we cannot ignore the first third of her game, which was so bad. It was so bad. It was so messy, and it put her in such a vulnerable position. In the beginning of the game, Bayleigh makes herself a very clear figurehead for the women's side of the house. She makes herself probably the biggest leader of the women's side of the house, and makes it very abundantly clear that she is working with the women and that she wants to take the women deep into this game. And that ultimately tanks her position and all of the social capital that she has. While she does have these very solid inroads with the women, with the men, she has nearly nothing, as she makes it abundantly clear that hey, I'm targeting you, and that makes her a very big target. The blow up she has with Vivek in week 2 doesn't make any matters any better, as it just further cements where she is in the house, and it just makes herself such a big target, as it really exemplifies Bayleigh as such an emotional and such an explosive player that could be pretty dangerous to people's games, where she is the primary target in week 3, as she is the target that Vivek wants to go home. And then in week 4, she is the backdoor target that Elijah wants to go home. Mind you, I don't think she ever goes home in those scenarios. I firmly believe that Bayleigh does have the votes to stay in both scenarios, but still, the fact that Bayleigh was targeted so early on and had the potential to possibly become a pre-juror is so concerning for her game, and I have to take that into account. But after Elijah's HOH and the executive veto, we really start seeing Bayleigh's game skyrocket. I mean, we can even see it with the beginning of the executive veto, where Bayleigh is the primary voice in Victoria's ear, telling Victoria to take Todd off the block, in a position where it's probably not even Victoria's best move to take Todd off the block. But because Bayleigh values Todd as such a valuable asset and an ally, Bayleigh is able to convince and persuade Victoria into saving Todd. And Bayleigh's able to do that multiple times throughout the season. Todd was not really good for Victoria's game whatsoever, but because Bayleigh was this constant presence in Victoria's strategic decision making, Victoria was genuinely convinced that Todd was good for her game, when in actuality Todd was only good for Bayleigh's game. And the fact that Bayleigh's able to drag Todd all the way to the final 4 is super impressive. Bayleigh should not have been able to take Todd that far, but because she was able to influence probably the most influential player in the game at that point in Victoria, it's honestly very impressive. And I'm thoroughly surprised that she is able to recover so well from losing her closest ally in week 2 in Donna. The fact that she was a target in week 3 and 4. The fact that she's able to recover from those things and put herself in a better position is very, very impressive. I think Bayleigh also convincing Victoria during the double eviction to keep Todd off the block, and then convincing Anthony during the final 5 to keep her off the block. Bayleigh is just able to put herself in self-preservation mode and is able to just actively convince the people in power that what is best for their game is best for their game, when in actuality it's only what is best for her game. And it's honestly very impressive to see. One of the biggest issues that I have seen and that I do agree with is how much of that was actually intentional, or how much of that was actually strategic gameplay, or was that more so just Bayleigh playing with her emotions. She makes it even abundantly clear in her finale speech that she was an emotional player, but her playing with her emotions doesn't hinder her as a player, as her emotions tend to actually drive her in the correct direction. So even though Bayleigh may be perceived as an emotional player, I still have a huge amount of respect for her, as she really has redefined what it means to be an emotional player, where being considered emotional had a really negative connotation to it. But now Bayleigh has really redefined it and really repurposed the overall meaning where being emotional isn't a bad thing. You know, your emotions are probably the most natural part of you, and allowing them to influence your decision making is not a bad thing, as Bayleigh's emotions probably influence the best moves for her game. So Bayleigh just had a very impressive game towards those latter ends, and the fact that she's able to use her emotions to build such meaningful connections with the jury. Like, she gets Tola to vote for her. Like, what? Tola of all people? Come on. Like, there's no world in any sense in which Tola should have voted for Bayleigh to win over Anthony. But the fact that Bayleigh was able to get that done through the means of just building that solid bond and building that respect with him is overall very, very impressive. And she does come out of the season with a 6-1 win. So overall, despite her very messy gameplay in the beginning, I'm thoroughly impressed with how she played this overall season. So because of that, I have her here at number 2. Now at number 1, the HouseGuest I believe played the best game on Big Brother Canada 12 is Anthony. And there definitely is some debate between Bayleigh and Anthony about who deserves to be number 1 and who deserves to be number 2. But I think Anthony played the most consistently strong game throughout the entire season, as he was always in a solid social position to the point where he was never in a really detrimental position where he was going to go home. And I find that to just be super impressive. Like, from top to bottom, the only true time I really think he's in true danger of going home is at the Final 4 and Final 3, where competition results just need to go in his favor. And they do, luckily so. They do end up going in his favor. But the fact that those two positions at the very, very tail end of the game are the only times in which Anthony is in a position of danger is thoroughly impressive. Playing one season where you don't ever get nominated, some people can call that as a fluke, as there has been some very recent instances in which players have made it to the Final 3 without ever being nominated, and people have definitely raised an eyebrow okay, is it really that hard? But the fact that he was able to do that on 2 separate seasons back to back, that has to have some credence to it, and it has to show that Anthony was doing a lot of the right things in this game. Anthony was genuinely playing one of the strongest games of Big Brother Canada, the history of it. Mind you, I think Anthony's game on Big Brother Canada 7 was overall a lot more stronger in terms of influence and dominance, more so than Big Brother Canada 12. But some of Anthony's most impressive maneuvers come from this season. The 3 big moves that everybody's talking about this season from Anthony are just so impressive. The fact that he is able to convince Vivek to target Dinis. The fact that he's able to convince Victoria to convince Avery to target Kayla. And the fact that he's able to turn Bayleigh and Todd against Victoria. The fact that Anthony is able to execute all of these moves with all of his information is just absolutely mind-blowing. It's flabbergasting, and it's honestly a display of how phenomenal of a game player Anthony is. Anthony truly is a master at withholding information and keeping it to himself until absolutely necessary. Anthony is somebody who's, when he receives information, he's not just going to let that leak. He's going to hold on to it until it is absolutely necessary for him to use it. And I think that's what makes Anthony such a strong player. In terms of the game he played this season, while he did show very impressive displays of maneuvering and manipulating and convincing people to make moves that are in his best interest, he's definitely not in a solid position of control in comparison to somebody like Victoria. Victoria was definitely the most influential and the most domineering presence within the entire house. It's pretty clear that Victoria was running things throughout the beginning of this game. It's abundantly clear that Victoria was that figurehead. And because of that, there's a lot of moves in the early stages of the game that do not go Anthony's way. The executive veto. Anthony wanted it to be used on Tola, but instead Victoria uses it on Todd. The very next round, Anthony loses his number 1 ally in Matthew. And then during the movie night massacre, when he wants to target Kayla and Avery, he ends up sending home Elijah, a possible pawn that he could have cultivated to be a very solid number for him. But instead, he just lets Elijah go. So that streak of back-to-back-to-back losses is just really detrimental to his game. at least initially. But then Anthony's able to convince Victoria to target Kayla, and then his whole game turns around, and he's in a much better position than beforehand. However, the biggest elephant in the room is his final 5 HOH, as that is the defining moment where he loses the game. I do agree in the sense that, like, the reasoning behind why he targeted Victoria. However, I don't think that that was the optimal move. With Anthony being as knowledgeable about the overall game of Big Brother, Anthony should have known how bitter of a juror Victoria was going to be. So, in my opinion, with Anthony winning that final 5 HOH, I think he should have targeted Bayleigh, as we see that Bayleigh becomes a very big jury threat by the end of the game. So, Anthony is at least able to preserve his relationship with Victoria in that sense. I think Anthony's endgame route should have been taking out Bayleigh in Final 4. Victoria most likely wins that Final 4 HOH considering how good she is in the quiz comps. But then Lexus wins that final veto. So then Todd goes home in 4th. And then in that Final 3, Anthony either needs to win that final HOH and take out Victoria, or somehow get Lexus to win that final HOH and then take out Victoria. But even then, that's super shaky considering that Victoria is so good in those endgame quiz comps that Victoria was a serious threat to win those competitions. So Anthony was really put in a lose-lose situation where either Victoria wins out and beats Anthony in the Final 2, or Anthony takes out Victoria in 5 like he does and then loses the game. Despite what some of the jurors are going to say, especially Victoria, are saying about Anthony's jury prospects, Anthony was never going to win a jury vote, unfortunately. Sitting next to Todd, Lexus, or Bayleigh, like, Anthony was never going to win any sort of jury vote because of how bitter Victoria was against Anthony. Like, Anthony was never going to win the game, and it's so unfortunate because he played such a solid game this season. Like, a lot of the things he does on this season are so impressive. People have made comparisons of Anthony's game this season to, like, Dan on Big Brother 14, and I absolutely agree with those comparisons. Like, a lot of Anthony's most impressive maneuvers are done on this season, but simply the makeup of the jury was just not in his favor, and he loses in a 6-1 vote. But even though he loses, I think overall he played the most consistently strong game throughout the entire season, which is why I have him here at number 1. Overall, this season of Big Brother Canada is such a mixed bag of gameplay. We see such impressive and dominant strategic control in this game through the likes of Bayleigh, Anthony, and Victoria. But then we also get some really questionable and bad gameplay in the likes of, like, Vivek and Avery. So in terms of, like, the overall level of gameplay this season, it's pretty fair to just say it was sloppy. It was sloppy, it was chaotic, and some might even say it was a bit spicy. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Get it? Anyways, I think this season's gameplay was just so chaotic, and I think because of that, it definitely added to the overall entertainment value of this season. There was no, like, one dominating strategic force that was running things from beginning to end, and it was so clear that they were going to win. Like, no, the gameplay was dynamic because it was so unpredictable. You would never know if people were going to make the best move for their game or an absolutely god-awful game-ending decision. Like, it was always up in the air what was going to happen every single week because of how generally unbridled the overall level of gameplay was on this season. And while this season might not be the most strategic and strong cast in terms of their gameplay, it's definitely one of the most entertaining in terms of their gameplay, and I'm overall very satisfied with the overall makeup of the gameplay that happened throughout this season. But those are just my thoughts. Leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share with your friends if you have any of those, and I'll see you all in the next video. Peace.